Hello again. So in this lecture, we're going to look at the theatres in which these early Greek tragedies were performed. Ancient Athens had two main theatres in which the plays of the Dionysia were performed. The larger one, the Theatre of Dionysus, was built at some time in the 6th century BC to coincide with the first city Dionysia. The Theatre of Dionysus is quite staggering in terms of size and accomplishment. It was cut into a rock face in central Athens to ensure acoustic dampening, and when it was operational, it would have housed around 17,000 people in an auditorium which was built on 3 levels. The acoustics are eerily good. Most of the theatre still stands today, the upper levels don't, and one can stand on stage and speak at a conversational volume while being perfectly audible to someone at the backmost row of the remaining auditorium, which is almost a kilometre away. Victorian theatres built to house fewer than 1,000 people, about 2,400 years later, do not have acoustics which are nearly as good. The less said about the Royal Albert Hall in this respect, the better. The other theatre was the Odeon of Athens. Odeon means singing place. It's where the cinema chain gets its name. That theatre was smaller, but it was by no means small. Its area was about 4 kilometres squared, and it had a roof which was supported by 90 internal pillars. It was built by Pericles in 435 BC, and it housed both musical theatre, its initial purpose, and tragedies for consideration in the Dionysia. Remember, the Dionysia was a competition which weren't being performed in the main theatre. Nothing remains of the original Odeon as it was burnt down between 87 and 86 BC. It's often mistaken by tourists and less knowledgeable tour guides for the Odeon of Herodes Atticus, which still exists, which is nearby and which is largely intact. However, that Odeon was built much later, in about 161 AD, so many centuries after the last Dionysia. The Odeon probably had, that's the Odeon of Athens, probably had an auditorium for seating about 5,000 people, but the records here are a bit hazy. That would still make it larger than any of the theatres, the purpose-built theatres that we have today. What we can say with certainty from what remains of Greek theatres and from the records of contemporaries who saw performances in the Dionysia was that the stages were capable of real technical complexity. Plays would be performed on a wooden thrust stage. So we've got the sort of rocks of the theatres, but all of the wood's gone. But they'd been performed on a wooden thrust stage, which would have had a trapdoor, a balcony, a large set of double doors at the back, and a crane to lower performers from the roof to the stage. The crane went by the name of the machina and was often used to portray gods descending from on high onto the stage, hence the term deus ex machina, or translated for us, God from the machine, God from the machina. Several Greek plays made use of the deus ex machina, in which a god came down to the protagonist to intervene in the affairs of the play. Some tragedies clearly used it well, and in other plays it was used for comic effect. Aristophanes uses it. What However, it was generally considered by Aristotle to be an example of poor playwriting. And the term deus ex machina is used today for a sudden plot twist in literature which resolves conflict but does so in an unlikely or sometimes ridiculous way. The astute amongst you will have noticed that this description of a Greek stage is identical to that of the stage at the Globe Theatre, built approximately 2,200 years later. That's not a coincidence. Not only was the Globe stage designed on the model of the ancient Greek stage, But Shakespeare also used his stage in the same way. There are only 3 Shakespeare plays in which the Deus ex machina is used, but every other staging technique Shakespeare could borrow, from Aeschylus and Euripides, 2 of the prominent tragic playwrights, he did. Especially horrific murders in Greek tragedy take place behind the double doors at the back of the stage. The understanding here is that the sense of horror is increased if the audience do not see the death, but instead see the shock of those leaving the inner chamber in which the murder has taken place. The unseen and the unknown is always more troubling than that which we can see in front of us. This is used to great effect when Aeschylus has Agamemnon murdered by his wife behind those doors. And the same effect is used by Shakespeare when Macbeth kills Duncan behind those doors at the back of the stage. Duncan's bedchamber then becomes a place of unknowable horror. Each character who enters it returns blood-stained and profoundly psychologically changed. An interesting experiment made by Shakespeare is in Othello, where he moves the bedchamber onto the stage. Desdemona is killed by Othello in her bed on stage. Othello is a more experimental tragedy, and when we study Othello, we'll look at those experiments, those changes that Shakespeare was making to establish Greek tragic form. Shakespeare was an attentive student of the mechanics of Greek theatre. And while we have little by way of explanation for how some of his stage directions were achieved, The Winter's Tale's stage direction, Exit Pursued by a Bear, is a mystery that will probably never be solved, but I think many people have some theories. Other stage directions clearly have precedent in the accounts of particular theatrical marvels of the Dionysia. The stage direction in Macbeth, Witches Vanish, would have clearly needed to use the trapdoor and some form of concealment in which witches disappear from the stage via a non-apparent means. Here, a temporary physical screen could be used to hide their departure, but a much more atmospheric solution would be to hide them in the smoke created by a fire positioned beneath the stage. One look inside the stage at the globe will show that such a thing is perfectly possible, and references to the use of black smoke for effect have appeared in accounts of Greek tragedies also. A change in what the fire was burning, if you have a fire running all the way through the play, would allow the witches to be able to literally disappear in a puff of smoke. And that's something that would have been as impressive in 1602 AD as it would have been in 442 BC. In our next lecture, we'll look at what exactly it is that makes a play a tragedy, and we'll begin to look in depth at Aristotle's Poetics. Thank you very much.